Chapter 7. The River of Night. Shoulder deep among the thick bushes, the huge beast threw back its head, shaking its shaggy mane in the thin sunlight, its long horn gleaming. Elof and the Alfar woman ducked hastily lower on their high branch, though they knew it could neither see nor smell them this far downwind. Strings of soil-caked roots hung from its mouth, tangling among the fringes of coarse, cream-white fur as its champing jaws pulled them in, its breath steaming in the cold morning air. Its small ears flicked, its little wrinkled eyes blinked about, reddened by the new-risen sun. Then it snorted thick clouds from its nostrils and went back to its rooting. "Be he not a beauty?" whispered the Alfar woman, half hugging Elof with the spidery arm she kept across his back, nervous he might fall. "And his winter white not yet shed. Long I am watching that one, hasty to have the chase o' him. But only this year is he of lawful age. Already the young males best him at the matings, so he forages alone. Soon he will be too old to run far, and then the wolves will have him, or the dagger teeth, or some night walkers. Better and quicker he falls to us." White teeth flashed in her long brown face. Elof smiled, though his muscles creaked from endless hours crouched among tree limbs. "Better indeed," he whispered back, "and all the more honor to us that you share this hunt, Haffy." "Honor is ours, lord," Haffy whispered, stabbing Elof still more keenly with shame at the deception he planned. And yet, that odd name Haffy was a diminutive of Halveth, an ancient and honored woman's name among the northern royal kin. What blood flowed in her veins? What great lord or lady of Morven had let fall the shackles of their old life to become her parent? She looked around. "Ah, Guys comes. Do you watch with Lord Elof, Guys? I go to fetch the others." Silently she slithered along the branch and was gone. No less silently, Guy's massive frame, clad in an Alfar tunic and harness, swung down in her place beside Elof. Elof looked around anxious and angry. Guy's was at home here, so much so Elof still wondered whether it had been safe to trust him. "By all the powers, Guys," he hissed as low as he could, "I tell you once more, you've got to come with us. We'll need you. You of all people." But the big forester only looked away and shook his head slightly. Elof grabbed him by the shoulder. "You joined this venture to aid the Northland fugitives. It's your duty." Guy shook his head again, firmly. More than ever he seemed to fumble for words. "No, Master Elof, no. You, where you will. Me, I stay. Like I said to my lord, for now. A new home it was I came to find, and that I have, and damned if I'll leave it." Elof sighed. "So you fail us, as well as Arvis. Nothing will detach him from the court." "And why not?" whispered Guys, the accusation stinging words from him. "Him and me? We're the oldest. We've not the summers left to build new lives. Not like you yonkers. What'll we find, us, that's better than this? They're gentlefolk, these, though a mite slow in the head. Take you in, not fuss you. Not jealous with their women, either. I've one among them already. Maybe a little un on the way." He jabbed a blunt finger into Elof's chest. "You, wise master, don't you go prating to me of your long tomorrow. What's it to me? So far hence, even my son's sons won't see it. You tell me in the here and now, what life's better for a forester like me?" "A free one?" But Guy shrugged. "Free's as free does, to a plain man like me. The forest's not half the hard taskmaster your headmen or town elders were back home. You should know that, master, from all I hear of your beginnings. Elof grimaced. There was truth in what he said. Now, though, he had fewer doubts. Guys had not changed much, if only because little change had been needed. But that, oddly, made it harder to leave him behind. If only it did not feel so much like abandoning you. Guys grunted. The river for that. We choose with our eyes open, Arvis and me. More open than yours, maybe. Hist now, lest he hears us, he below. But it was to the heights he looked, for just then a soft rustle in the foliage announced the arrival of the other hunters. There was a slight springing of the branch beneath them, and Kermorven inched silently along it. Elof was glad to see him so limb-lithe after many months of inactivity. They would have need of all his skill and speed for this. Kermorven's brows arched as he saw the sight of their prey. Does the one horn please ye, lords? Demanded Hafi softly. No easy quarry is he. Against his hide, mere arrows from the treetops do not serve. Spear or halberd, it must be, in belly or throat where he is softest, on the ground and close to. We stalk him through the leaves, and of a sudden drop down. Elof swallowed and stole another look at the brute. The idea seemed impossible. The great horse-like head was carried higher than any horse's, the horn on it alone almost as tall as himself. It was bulkier even than a dragon, and, save for that living wall, the mammoth, the largest beast he had ever seen on land. This was madness, and yet Kermorven was taking it quite calmly, deciding with Hafi which trees would be best. Finally, they waved to the others, and the Alfar moved up to help the humans through the branches. Elof needed little help, even with the halberds slung across his back, and the clumsy pack the Alfar had tried to persuade him to leave. He'd grown used to this way of getting about. There was no denying the thrill of being at home so high up. It made the forest seem a different place, less hostile, more fascinating in the richness and variety of the life that worked out its purposes below. It was like nothing he had ever experienced in the world outside. And then he realized with a little tremor of shock that the world outside scarcely seemed real anymore. Once more, far from his shielding forge, he could hardly imagine a world beyond the trees. For the passing of 2 seasons, he had been immured within them, more than half a year of travel and of rest. Or was that all? He seemed to have resisted the forest's timeless thrall better than his fellows. But might not that be an illusion also? Might not a century have passed out there while he had shaped and schemed in the shadows? Kerbrheim might be long since fallen and overrun, mere circles of overgrown ruins haunted by owl and wolf, or torn down piecemeal to surround the Ekwesh stockades. He shuddered. A sudden horror of the outside passed through him, of haste and peril and problems he could not solve with study and cunning and skilled labor. He did not want to face it. He wanted to lurk and lair among the trees and forget. Then the touch of a hand jolted him alert, a silent signal passing among the shadowy shapes in the leaves. He peered down. He could see little save bushes, but he could hear the snort and grunt of the one-horn all too loudly. A bush jerked noisily aside, and a shoulder of tangled white hair came into view, too close for his comfort. Slowly, silently, he unslung the halberd, made sure his pack would not hitch upon the branches. To his left he heard a faint sound, and saw their Borhi, sweating and shaking, green with fear. The young corsair had balked violently at the idea of leaving the castle, but had decided he liked being left there rather less. Elof gestured reassuringly, but himself began to shiver. He would have been tense enough simply with the prospect of facing that beast, But far more than that was about to happen. Another touch, a sharp one, and then a sudden, fierce springing in the branch beneath him. There was no time to think, to hesitate. Elof simply kicked out his legs. The whipping branch jerked out from under him as a trap fell, or as a trap below the gibbet, and into empty air he plunged. But the ground was nearer than it looked. His feet were ill-prepared. It slammed into his soles with bruising force. He fell aside and rolled on his back, holding the halberd high. There was a snort and a crash, and he sprang up to find the light before him blotted out by a wall of tangled whiteness that reared and plunged among a flurry of greenery, shaking the earth. A figure bounced past, caught his arm. Rock, and beside him Burr and Tenvar, jabbing with their halberds at the mountainous beast that wheeled and bellowed defiance, unable to find a clear path to charge. "This way!" screamed Rock. As they had planned, they were not attacking the beast, but keeping it between them and the startled Alfar. Elof was only too ready to turn and bolt under the trees. He saw Ills and Kermorven there, but where was Borhi? The corsair stood still where he had dropped, staring aghast at the travelers as they ducked past the plunging one-horn. "Borhi!" yelled Elof. "This way! Now!" The corsair seemed to hear, turned and ran a few steps, then halted, hesitated, shaking his head and gesticulating frantically. "No!" he wailed. "I can't! I won't! I'm safe here! Come back! You'll all die! All die!" Cursing, Elof tore free of Rock's arm and whirled back after Borhi. Then he had only the fraction of a heartbeat to throw himself aside as the maddened beast at last ducked down its immense head and charged. Borhi, unmoving, seemed not to see it, or to understand what he saw. The monstrous thing bearing down on him like the corsair's own galley with out-thrust ram. The great conical horn, the length of his own body, struck into the center of him and hurled him torn and spilling through the air. A trampling hoof shattered the half-frozen earth a hand's breadth from Elof's head. The great flank whirled past him, red-streaked from halberd thrusts, and then a huge hand was scooping him up. Guises. "Run!" growled the tall forester. "Well, you can!" He all but hurled Elof into the arms of his friends, and spun him out to fling his halberd at the beast. It whirled and charged again across the path of the startled Alfar, who had to dive for cover among the bushes. Then Kermorven's clear voice called, and the travelers were running with the braided throats and agony in their sides, chests working like Elof's bellows, the fire of his forge in their tortured lungs. Behind them the uproar grew, trampling and smashing in the brush and shouting they could hear even over the roaring in their ears. The hunters would have to slay the thing before they dared follow. Elof found himself hoping it would not slay any of them. As Guys had said, in themselves they were gentle enough folk. It was the forest's power that made them shadows of malignity, wood sprites working dark secrets within the tree gloom. Better to evade them thus if they could, than come to open fight. A stream gleamed among the trees ahead, and Kermorven gestured to them. Into the water they must go, and upstream. But as they splashed into the icy shallows, he himself ran right across and out onto the far bank, leaving a fine trail of muddy footprints. Then as the ground grew hard underfoot, he leaped for an overhanging branch and swung himself back with the others into the stream. On and on they trotted, their feet soaking and numb, their packs and weapons turning to lead about them, their heads bowed down and staring at the water that seemed to suck the heart out of them. At last it dawned on them that they were walking, and slowly at that. Burr and Tenvar were weaving as if about to fall down in the water, and Ills, whose legs were shorter, suffered badly from the cold. With wordless gasps, Kermorven drove them up the bank among thorny bushes, and there they collapsed, numbed to stab and scratch, deaf to anything save their own whooping gasps. Elof heard somebody retching, and his own stomach turned over. His feet turned slowly from numbness to fire. "So," wheezed Kermorven at last, "we have some small advantage of them, and we must not lose it. To the forest's edge, by Guy's guessing, was a good day and a half march. Up, all, and to the north." There was a chorus of groans, but nobody failed to stagger to their feet, or to keep up with the brisk marching pace Kermorven set. Indeed, they seemed almost more enthusiastic now, weary as they were, as if some burden invisible and intangible were lifted from their shoulders. After a while, when he was sure enough of his breath, Elof mentioned this to Kermorven, who nodded. "I feel as much myself. We draw near the forest's rim. May that shield us from Tapaiau's sight." All that day the dwindled company marched at a relentless pace, until the sun, hidden hitherto beyond the leaden clouds, blazed angry orange beyond the dark treetops around them. Mercifully, the undergrowth grew thinner the further they went, for now it was chiefly a forest of pines, firs, and spruces, with only a few hemlock and cedar and cypresses. Their soft needles carpeted its floor, and few lesser things grew in their shadow. The brief spring of those climes was not yet come, to fill shrubs and grasses with a short spasm of life and growth ere the chill closed in once more. The air was still but raw, burning in their nostrils and on their cheeks, and, with their wet boots, draining the warmth from their bodies. As night fell, they chose a dry spot to camp. Fire would have been infinitely welcome, but they did not dare build one, lest it drew down the alfar or worse upon them. A shelter of pine branches was the best they could contrive, and they huddled together to keep warm. They ate little, for they had not been able to bring much food with them, and knew it might have to last some time. Then, too weary to set a watch, they slept. But it was a poor night's sleep, for the forest was full of strange noises, and many things unknown passed close by them. And some way past the middle hours, dreams of conflict and tumult jolted Elof awake. Parting the branches, he peered out at the sky in the hope of seeing some trace of dawn, and caught his breath. For a faint light shone through the treetops, but it was cold and constant, and it paled not the eastward, but the northward stars. So once again, after many years and many other perils, he beheld the sign and banner of their fountainhead, the eerie glow of the ice. Morning, gray, bleak as ever, found them chilled and aching and uneasy, eager only to be gone from there. Walking loosened their muscles, but brought them little warmth and less comfort, save that there was no sound of pursuit. "So they have not found our trail," muttered Kermorven. "I hardly dared hope it." "Maybe they searched the wrong way," suggested Ills. "Eastward or south. They might not guess we'd take the way north, that they fear." Kermorven nodded. "That must be it. But when Tapaiau's eye turns this way, still, we should be within an hour or two of the margins, and those they will not cross." So the travelers cast nervous glances at the trees about them, expecting every moment to be shot at from the branches, or fallen upon like the one-horn. That nothing came only made them the more uncertain. The borders of the forest might be minutes away, or hours, and all manner of ambushes set between. But suddenly, as they came out onto the bank of a dank little streamlet, Glamorgan stopped and pointed. "See, the far bank, beyond the trees." That there should be anything beyond the trees, save more trees, was a hard thing to realize. Yet they did indeed seem thinner, further apart. Light as cold as the sky above shone pale upon their trunks, unhindered. It must be a wide clearing, for the trees of the far side were an indistinct black line. The forest was growing thin indeed. Down the bank they hurried, splashing through the water without seeking a drier crossing. Elof stopped short, gasping. It was as if some chill weight had suddenly settled on his heart. Burr, limping along last, missed his footing on the bank and all but fell back in. Rock and Elof, turning to haul him in, looked back, saw the pines bend and sway, and heard the rushing as of a great wind that they knew was no wind. "Kermorven!" they yelled. "I hear!" he cried, and sweeping out his sword, he urged the others past him. "Now for it! Run! And stop for nothing! Run to the light!" Only when Berg went crashing by him, with Rock and Elof on his heels, did Kermorven turn and run with them, leaping and bounding. The way was further than it looked, and there was more undergrowth here. Frost-browned grasses and low-tangled bushes that grew in the lee of fallen trunks. It seemed almost to rise up and snag them as they went, and the branches whipped and lashed across their faces. Kermorven hewed at them furiously, and Elof drew sword also. It was like fighting some live enemy, some beast with 1,000 entangling arms above and below. And at their very heels now was the wind rush, all but overhead. Elof winced, expecting arrows in his back any moment. But all the time the light grew stronger, the open space seemed wider, the other side more distant. Then, suddenly, staggering from one tree to another, Elof realized there were no branches overhead, nothing but the gray sky, and that the trees beyond were even further apart, a gap wider than the longest arms. Ahead of him he saw a root snag Ilse's ankle, tripping her into his path, and Kermorven scoop her up almost without breaking stride. A jagged stump snagged Elof's cloak, and in one whirling movement the black blade hewed flying splinters from it, and he was sprinting after the others. Ahead of them was open space, and they were slowing, staring, almost stopping. "Too near!" he yelled. "Still within bow shot!" Then he also slowed and stared. It was no clearing they were in. Trees ahead there were, a line of them tall and dark, impenetrable as the densest forest. But to left and right, where the line should have curved back to surround them, there was only open space. Near at hand it was flat grassland streaked with half-thawed snow, sparse stands of scrub, wiry and stunted, poking up here and there. Beyond it was grayness, with a glimmer that might be water. There were other lines of trees, but none more than stands, clumps, scarcely linked to one another across the snowy scrubland and dismal pools, and nowhere to the trees of the forest. Elof, turning to look back, saw the outmost trees bend and tremble, yielding tall figures that stalked and paced within the bounds of the tree shadow, like menacing specters afraid of day. They would not step beyond the fortress of the forest, the immense wall of trees outflung to either side, set like vast uneven ramparts against this chill open land. He knew then that they had reached the bounds of Tapiau's power. They were out of the forest at last, free as he had fought to make them. What was this heaviness upon his heart then? This faint, nagging ache within him which was no pang of honest weariness? Why could he not rejoice? By him Kermorven stood, his face as grey and grim as this land they had come to, and as desolate. "Genhia sa terrace," he was muttering. "Genhia sa o Corrington." Then he lifted up his sword as a salute. But from the forest a single arrow came curving, to plunge into the icy soil some way short of them, and there shiver to pieces, as against a stone. "Come," said Ilse hastily, drawing them both away. "That may have been a ranging shot. Let us not await a volley." But in a lower voice she added, "I am sorry about Terrace. Could she not have come with us?" Kermorven's face was set, but Elof was shocked by the deep unhappiness in his voice. "I did not dare ask her. She who had dwelt so long in Tapiau's thrall. She might have betrayed us. I would not risk us all for her alone, when there was no certainty she would come, or be happy if she did." Elof swallowed. "Believe me, I am sorry. I was never sure how much she meant to you." The tall man's mouth twisted. "No more was I, and I to her? Something new, perhaps, to be tempted, teased out, made to last as long as might be, lest it grow stale. To be lured ever within the hand, yet kept from the heart." He shook his head. "No more was I. Matters are better as they are, lesser now than greater to come. Day advances, and we must go." And swiftly he turned his back upon the forest, and strode out at a fierce pace across the grey ground. Elof and Ilse looked at their companions, and fell in behind him. Thus it was that they entered Townlaw on Arathans. Townlaw the wastes, the grey and shadowy marchlands of the ice. Certainly it was no hospitable land they saw stretching out before them. Kermorven stamped on the snow-spattered earth as he walked, and it rang and crunched beneath his boots. "This will be a swamp soon, when the thaw comes," he remarked, his voice more normal now. "As well we left our flight no later. We would surely have been mired here, and taken." Elof gazed around him uncomfortably. "Save for the trees, it reminds me of the salt marshes, the worst parts." "Small wonder in that," said Ilse, "for both that land and this are shaped and sustained by the outflowing meltwater of the ice. The same shadow lies over both." "It is less flat than the marshes," said Elof thoughtfully, "though the rise and fall is very slight. But if anything, it is wetter, and that means the water is pooled in the valleys and dips, and cuts channels between them." "A land of pools and rivulets and little lakes," agreed Kermorven. "Of mists and mires and quags. All bitterly chill and hard to cross. There will be no fixed paths in such a place, not even animal tracks. We will have to go around and about so much, it will be hard to keep to anything like a straight route." "Let us not be drawn too far northward all the same," warned Ilse. "Remember the evil name of this land." Nevertheless, even on that first night, they found themselves with little choice. For in their way they came upon a wide, swampy area that ended only under the eaves of the forest itself, and was already more than half thawed. When they climbed to the top of a low slope to spy out its extent, Elof, whose eyes were keenest in the ashen dimness of afternoon, exclaimed in dismay. "A river flows through it," he cried. down from the north, and among the trees." "Aye," said Tenvar, "a vast river, twice as wide as the forest river. There is no fording it here, even if we dared go back among the trees. That water flows fast, and it is very dark." Hill squinted into the grayness. "Dark indeed," she muttered. "There are tales among my folk of such a river, that flows from the black lakes in the northern wastes down through the forest. They are darker yet. The Kalmajozake it is to us, river of the dead." "Yet the living must cross somewhere," muttered Kermorven, "or they will not long remain so. There is little to eat in this land. What is that upriver there? An island?" "It seems so," admitted Elof, straining his eyes. "A large one, covered with trees. There are more along the banks. We might try there for rocks or shallows." Kermorven nodded. "We might, though the current may be faster." He saw the others looking at him expectantly and shrugged. "You wish me to choose? I see no choice. We may at least find somewhere more sheltered than this to sleep." They turned northward then, skirting the margins of the cold swamp, and plodded wearily on into the barren lands. Even over the short distance they could make out ahead, they saw the lines of trees grow fewer and shorter, the land flatter and more desolate. Only coarse grass covered the soil, and a few bushes that cowered low to avoid the searing wind, their tough strands running through the grass like entangling tentacles. It was a miracle no ankle or leg was broken in that gathering gloom. They feared lest it might grow too dark to go on, even with ills to guide them. But around sunset there came a fierce, gusty wind that drove the clouds like sheep to the horizon, and there tore them to bloody shreds. It gave the keen air an edge like jagged glass, and for all their warm hunting garb, it cut the travelers to the bone. The rough ground leached their strength away as they stumbled and faltered over it. In the clear sky, the stars appeared like frost flecks upon cold stone. The full moon, rising, rained down its sterile light upon the bleak lands. And all across the sky to the north, in answer or in mockery, there arose the shimmering curtain of the ice glow. But when they lifted their streaming eyes against the blast, they saw tossing black against it the tops of thick meshed wood, upon which the moonlight fell without lightening its solid gloom. "The island!" cried Tenvar. "The island's thick with trees, shelter, and fuel." "Would you light a fire in this place?" cried Ills. "I would," barked Rock. "We'll need shelter and more to stay living this night." "There is a rapids," cried Burr. "See the white water about the rocks? And past the island as well. It goes right over. There's our crossing." "If anywhere," agreed Kermorven, "but go with great care. The rocks will be icy, and death swift in those black waters. I will lead." Of that crossing, Elof remembered little save weariness and terror. The cold rocks and the roar and swirl of the river around their feet as they clambered between them. The moonlight was clear, or they would never have managed some of the wider leaps. Burr and Ills were at a terrible disadvantage, and had often to be swung across on the single length of rope they had. But even longer eggs were aching before they came beneath the first overhanging branches, and saw the island rise stark above them. "Find a hollow!" gasped Elof, as they clambered up the steep bank. "Screen fire! With branches!" Il shook her head fiercely, and he caught the glint of fear in her look. But even she, stronger and hardier than most men, was too chilled and weary to argue. Elof and Kermorven were little better, and Rock, Tenvar, and Burr staggering as if drunk. Burr had fallen at least once, and leaned on Kermorven's arm for support. Nevertheless, they waited on the bank, slumped against the lichen-encrusted trunks of the black spruces, while Ilse with her night eyes searched the gloom. The wind whined through the branches overhead, their hard needles rattling and whispering horribly. It reminded Elof of gibbets he had seen outside the ruined farms of Bryhane. But at last, she grudgingly admitted she could see nothing amiss, and the travelers hobbled gladly into shelter. As Elof had suggested, they found a hollow, a deep gully carved by some flood long ago, and now well screened by the wiry undergrowth, taller here than in the open. Kermorven kindled flame in a hastily dug pit, and while the others cut branches to screen the little camp, Elof decided to fetch water for a hot broth. Very slowly and carefully, keeping low and rustling the bushes as little as he could, he slid out from among the trees and along the bank to a spot where he might fill a water skin without falling in. He lay down at a place where the water had cut away the bank, shuddering at the freezing touch of the soil, and lowered the skin into the dark water. The cold water bit agonizingly at fingers just recovering from their numbness, and he leaned down further to make sure he could hold the full skin. A gleam caught his eye, and he stared in horror. The water had sliced a section through the bank, and the face of it glimmered gray-white in the river's reflection. Under a hand's depth, little more, of brown grass and peaty soil, there lurked a layer of some whitish substance. He reached down to touch it and jumped at the chill throb in his fingers. It was a deep layer of solid ice. He looked up and down the bank opposite and saw many such gleams, always at the same shallow depth, though in some places it seemed to have forced the ground upward. Suddenly the whole wide land seemed to him no more than shriveling skin atop a cold, empty skull. This far, within a day's march of the forest, the distant ice had already its hidden vanguard beneath the surface. The full skin tugged at his hand, and he reached down to put in its stopper. But as he did so, he saw a brief flicker of movement mirrored in the water, a swift dark shadow sweeping over moon and star. In one movement, he heaved up the skin and sprang back to cover. Then he saw it clear, a shape of sable wings outswept, arcing down the sky onto the moonlit blackness of the river. He heard the fierce wing beat as it settled, and then the graceful folding, the curving of the delicate neck into its shape. Down the flow of the flood it drifted, a huge swan gliding upon its own shadow over the glittering waters, but which the shadow, was hard to tell, for in every feather it was black. And as Elof stood there, beyond movement, beyond understanding, he heard a low music drift across the waters, a haunting, somber singing of dark things. For the music was a voice, low and mellow as that of a human woman, and its words of deep lamentation came clearly to him over the relentless lapping of the flood. Birds of the night sky, sorrow pursues me, far as I have flown over the land. Gather, hear me, far flew I, grief sought I, found I my fill. Of unstilled yearning I sing, of unquiet waters, of loss, of wandering I sing, by seas endless, tides ceaseless, under the empty sky, alas, Alas for sorrow! I sing of living. Far flew I, grief sought I, found I my fill. Of hope past hoping I sing, of wounds unhealed, of rue, of suffering I sing, of mouth on mouth, breast on breast, all that may never be. Alas, alas for sorrow! I sing of loving. Far flew I, grief sought I, found I my fill. Of last despairing I sing, of the dark river, of pain, of lamenting I sing. A brand quenched, a flame swallowed, the stream flows silently. Alas, alas for sorrow! I sing of parting. Far flew I, grief sought I, found I my fill. Elof stood astounded as the creature glided slowly towards the bank. What he saw, what he hoped, was a whirling in his mind. The song was sorrow and terror, and it gripped him fast. Not far along the bank arose a stand of reeds, dry and half-withered, whispering and creaking, and into these swept the dark swan. But even as it slid among them, it seemed to rear up. Its immense wings beat as if in fury, then shuddered closed across its breast. Upward rose the shadow, taller, more erect than any swan, and with sudden grace the wings swept open and back to reveal a breast of gleaming black mail. A human breast, a woman's breast, for below the mail coat bare legs gleamed, and above it lifted a woman's delicate throat, strong chin and full lips. The rest of her face, her hair, all was hidden by the eye mask of a shining helm. But from her shoulders sprang not arms, but the same wide wings held open to their fullest, blotting out the moon, shadowing her beyond recognition. Yet among the feathers it seemed to Elof that he saw a gleam of gold. Suddenly she cried out, in a voice grown so harsh, so terrible, that Elof dropped to one knee, shivering. Rash wanderer, man astray in realms men dare not dream of, hear me and beware. Already for some the lot is cast. Doom approaches. Doom no mortal turns aside. Flee, if flee you may. Or what is owed you, call for it. Seize it! The wings, whipped closed, beat once, powerfully, sending the reeds hissing low to the water. A great black swan lifted from the river and went wheeling high off across the water, over the island, out of sight. Elof's eyes followed it till it vanished behind the crests of the trees. What have I seen? He asked himself aloud, and heard his voice tremble. So like, and yet so terrible. What land of visions is this? Terror clawed at him. He scrambled up, seized the water skin, and bolted back up the slope towards the trees and the faint glimmer of the fire. As he stumbled and tripped through the wood, he heard Kermorvan's low voice, and rocks. They seemed like the finest and most comforting sounds he had ever heard. Something might be made of that southward way poor Corrington told us of. If Vade followed it to take his folk west, it might also be a safe route back east. Maybe, if it hasn't grown worse in all that time. Elof, what's the matter? Looks as if you've seen a ghost. I have seen, he muttered. Warning, perhaps. I know not. You sit down and get warm, ordered Il sharply. Here, give me that water. Don't drop it in the flames. Now, what was it you saw? But Elof could not shape words around what he had seen. A warning, he gasped. A judgment. We are in peril. Kermorvan sat up straight and swung the gray-gold blade across his knees. He looked at Elof intently, his face set, brows drawn tight. I need no vision to tell me that. Is it near? It approaches, gasped Elof. It said that. He stopped, because Kermorvan's intense gray eyes had widened abruptly. He was no longer looking at Elof, but was staring over his shoulder, brows arched, lips parted in amazement. In the same instant, Elof's skin crawled with the icy awareness of some presence at his back. He knew better than to look around. He was about to hurl himself forward, away, when out of the corner of his eye he saw a figure, somehow familiar, step forward and slouch casually down by the fire, holding out his hands and rubbing them hungrily. Steam rose from his clothes, which clung damply. The traveler stared, aghast. Then, just as Elof realized who it was he was looking at, Rock found his voice. Stan, by all the halls of Hela, how'd you come to escape those water things? How do you... The Corsair made no reply, but suddenly looked up with such a look of cold contempt on his face, dull and gray in the firelight, that Rock stopped short, opened his mouth as if to say something more, then slowly closed it. Kermorvan seemed not to move, yet suddenly all the tension of a drawn bow was in his body, drawn and ready to loose. His knuckles gleamed white on his sword hilt. Across the little hollow at the far edge of the firelight, other shapes were moving, approaching slowly, unhurriedly through the freezing night. Down through the encircling bushes they came in an uneven file, and the icicles that festooned the meager branches chimed and rang and shattered like glass at their passing. And as he saw the first of them, Elof sought to cry out, to spring up, but his limbs would not obey him. His tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, as if the chill air froze it there. For the first was Horvar, and he paid no heed to anyone, but came and sat by the fire as easily as if he had but left them a moment before. Fur hid his face in his plump hands, and the blood drained from the brown skin. Tenvar sat rigidly immobile among the capering shadows, but a faint moan of horror broke half-voiced from his lips. The wind screeched and flailed the branches overhead. The fire blew flat and roared like a trapped beast, light and shadow flickering faster than the eye could mark. Into the hollow they drifted, one by one, just as quietly, still without speaking, those members of the company whose quest had ended, who should be walking in the world no more by night or day. Behind Holvar strode tall figures that were Eisden, and Mael the bosun, and Dervis, who walked easily on a leg Elof had seen stripped to a tangle of raw sinew about the bone. Close behind Dervis moved Borhi, hunched up and clutching his arms tied around himself, as a man might to close his cloak against the chill. But he too, like the others, quietly took a place by the fire, with neither look nor word for those already there, and sat silently staring into the beating flames. And though his face was fixed in a grimace of fear, he spared not even a glance for what shambled in his steps. Cassie, the huntsman, eyes glittering malevolence where empty sockets had been, took his place by the fire, and within that firelit hollow, with the dead pines sighing and rattling above them, the living were outnumbered by the dead. No word was said, no figure stirred. Like silent statues they sat, the fire smoke eddying this way and that about them, and it seemed to Elof that the chill which gripped this land, the ice below its soil, had flowed up and into his veins, and set the fire's warmth at nothing. He was shivering violently, too violently to speak, even to form the words in his mind. The dead had joined them. Their eyes were not dead. A living will dwelt in them, and a glare of menace and accusation he could read as clearly as words. Then a thick branch toppled and rolled in the fire, unstopping a vent of flame blown blue by the wind. In the waft of smoky scent, Elof was suddenly reminded of his smithy on the marshlands, of lying by the forge during his long illness there, and of the tormenting phantoms that had gathered around him, those horrors he had faced, and in facing, overcome. The logs split with an explosive crack, spattering sparks. A pulsing fire traced out the grain in its bared heart, and a like flame surged up within him, a bitter anger at the silence around him. It was mockery, contempt, and that unearned. Whatever the outcome, he could at least voice a challenge and a defiance. He clenched his jaws to quell their shivering, and he spat out the words as if he hammered them hot from his anvil. "What do you want with us? Our friends you once were, but you do not come as friends should. Speak, or be gone. Leave what no longer concerns you." "Leave?" whispered a voice suddenly, and a cold breath of laughter coursed across the hollow like an echo of the wind. The voice was Stayhand's, but might have been any. The same meaning burned in all those faces. "Good, Smith. It was you left us. All of us. In ambush, in fight, in flight you left us. Pulled me down, shot in the throat. Spitted like a fowl, hunted like vermin, broken and drowned. Stripped the flesh from me like the bark off a willow twig, while you played tug-of-war. Said, promised you'd keep me safe. Left me to that beast. You left us, us. The voices came together, blurred into a hissing chant, almost void of human meaning. A wordless litany of hungry menace that battered at Elof's mind. He quailed for a moment under the weight of it, numbing, drowning, as under the impact of a waterfall. Then another voice sheared across it with the clean force of a sword cut. "Enough!" barked Kermorven, and his voice rang clearer and harder than Elof had heard it for many a day. "Enough, I say! Have I not laid such charges against myself, and worse, in all the long hours of these our wanderings? There are worse trials than you can put me to, worse terrors than you can inflict." For a moment, his voice lowered, his gaze dropped. "And did I not all but break myself in answering them? All but resign myself to inaction, to stagnation, where at least I need lead no others into harm?" Then he lifted his eyes again, and a fierce glare, a stormlight, shone in their grayness. "Bitterly did I regret your loss. I, even you, Cassie, troth-breaker who would have sacrificed a sworn comrade for a catch of meat. Craven who ran blindly to his own doom, out of the mercy of those who would have shielded him. I would have saved you, all of you, if I could, and risked my own life to do so. You, at least, should know that, Eisden. But I could not, and the burden of regret ground me down. But by the help of Elof, I was shown my answer. He stood, and the long gray sword he rested pointed down upon the ground before him, leaning his crossed hands upon its hilt. Weary as he seemed, it was as if strength flowed into him from the very horror he confronted, for his shoulders straightened, and his voice grew stern as stone. I was shown that to live eternally shielded from all the chances of life is to live shielded from life itself, from good as well as evil. It is to do no good, to receive no good, merely to exist, and in existing inevitably diminish. That the perils of life should be lessened is good, but that all risk should be avoided, even when great good may come of it, that way lies a path of foolishness. You knew there would be perils on our quest. You knew you risked your lives. But also you knew great good might come to pass. The only amends I may offer you is to fulfill that quest, to give value and meaning to the sacrifice you made by saving lives that would otherwise be lost, and ensuring that your names live on in honor. That is as much as I myself would wish. If you yet keep some aspect, some part of the true heart and mind of the men that once you were, then you will understand. And if you are not—" The tall man laughed suddenly, though in his voice there was no mirth. He slapped one hand hard on the hilt of the sword. "Then I bid you be gone, for among the living you have no place." The last defiant words rang out into silence so absolute that Elof caught his breath. Even the wind had died. Not a leaf stirred. The fire sank down to a flameless glow that spilled no color into the night. It was as if the whole scene were carved in black and silver, and with a great red stone at its heart. "It is you who have no place here." The voice jolted them all to their feet. Whose lips it came from, Elof did not know. Nor was he sure such a sound could come from a human mouth at all. So bloodless, so hollow, so vast. It was like the stark echo of some greater sound, greater and more terrible, though what he could hardly imagine. "You have no place here. From the moment you passed the tree wall, the lands you have walked in, the Grey Lands, are mine. And it is to the island of the dead you have come." Elof heard Ilse give an involuntary cry of alarm, and as quickly stifle it. Evidently the name was known to her. "They have no place here who are yet weak prisoners of the flesh, and here they spy and trespass at their most deadly peril." It was all the dead who spoke. Their heads were lifted now, their eyes fixed upon the travelers with an intensity that made them even less human. And the voice seemed to course at random from one mouth to another, sounding always the same, hollow and terrible. But Elof was as much angered as daunted to see those who had been his friends and companions so grievously abused. And though Kermorven, guessing his mind, flashed him a glance of caution, he spoke boldly in reply. "You, whoever you are, If we have no place in your domain, then equally you've no sway over us. Let us pass, and have loan. One day I shall hold this whole circle of the world in my hand. None are beyond my sway. I am the keeper. I am Taun. The name fell upon Elof's ears like a blow, dizzying, sickening. This was disaster. This was ruin. He had spoken with powers before, grown reckless, almost, in confronting them. But Raven seemed to be benign, and Tapayao believed himself to be. Not so this presence, this appalling sound of waste and desolation given voice. This was what he had been warned against, what he had striven against, what he had most feared. Perhaps they had strayed too far north, or perhaps, since the land was so underlaid with ice, they had been foolish ever to enter it. But whatever the truth of that, they had come directly under the eye of Tapayao's greatest adversary, one of the primal foes of life, betrayers of their trust, lords of the world's worst ills. In his arrogance, he had dared to bandy words with one of the ancient powers of the ice. But he remembered what Tapayao had told him. This town was a defeated power, reduced to a shadow of his former majesty, a mere marchwarden for the greater powers that had succeeded him. The greatest of these was Lohi, and had he not spoken to her, and outfaced her in defeating the mastersmith, her servant? And as he had started, so he must go on. There was no turning aside. So, though every hair on his hair bristled and lifted, he steadied his voice, and strove to copy in his deeper tones Kermorvan's proud ring. Keeper? What have such as you ever kept, save a vigil over the woes of men? To his astonishment, the voice sounded almost hurt. I wish men well, for they have minds. Am I not one of the loyal powers, loyal to that which was first and has been corrupted, the rule of pure mind? It is only the delusions, the distractions, the wastefulness of the flesh we seek to counter. So it is that here in the Grey Lands, I seek to preserve thought, to save all that is best in men. I gather the minds of men about me as they are purged of their gross bodies, their thoughts freed from the foolish lust for growth, for change. Elof swallowed. His mouth was dry, but he could feel the sweat trickling down and pooling in the folds of his shirt. But anger triumphed, and hotter than caution it flared, hotter than fear. A new rage added to the old as he looked upon the emptiness in the eyes of those who had been his comrades. He had had enough of the lies of powers that were as self-serving as those of men. Then you gather nothing, he shouted. What is real in men, if it survives at all, has slipped through your grasp. Any live human can see that. These are toys you show us, cunningly contrived to copy the actions of life. No more. Nothing. Nothing, cried Els, fired by his outrage. Husks, shells, shadows, no more. The same anger kindled among all the travelers. sparking from one to another as a forest fire leaps from tree to tree, and made the fiercer by the terror they felt. "Did you not hear me, Taun?" cried Kermorven, shaking his hard fist in the empty faces of the dead. "Without the power to live, to grow, men are no more than the sum of their memories. That is all you capture. That is all we see in these miserable, hungry things you show us. Emptiness and falsehood, that is your domain." "Aye," bellowed Rock harshly. "They've the shapes of folks, but where the folks gone? Gone, anyone can see it. They're like empty gloves, these shapes." "Like toys," spat Burr. "Toys, that's all you make of men." "Puppets to dance to your will," yelled Tenvar. "Call yourself keeper? Waster, despoiler, grave defiler, bird of carrion, so I name you." With fearful speed, without warning, the shape of Horvar launched itself upward from where it sat, seized Tenvar in its arms, and bearing him backward to the ground, it lunged open-mouthed at his neck. Even as Kermorven, with a great cry, swung up his sword and sprang right across the fire, Horvar's shade sank its teeth into Tenvar's throat, tore and worried like a wolf. Kermorven's blade, a fire-lit streak of gold, slashed once, twice about the thing, and in the same heartbeat, Burr's sword hewed its arm, and Ilse's axe rang against its skull. It rolled back, but Tenvar lay still, his hands outthrust, rigid, clawing at nothing, his wide eyes still and unseeing. Elof, frozen with horror, saw the other shapes rise up as one, and he seized Gorthar singing from the scabbard. The giant shape of Iasden loomed over him. Half sobbing, Elof slashed wildly. Gorthar sang a great dark note, and the creature was hurled back among the advance of the rest. They halted, stumbling, and the black blade snarled in the chill air as he wove it back and forth before them. Back they swayed as it passed, like dark reeds upon the marshes, but inched forward when it was furthest from them. Then he heard Rock cry out in disbelief, and could not help looking. The creature that was Horvar, hewn and slashed as it was on its feet once more and clawing out with its good arm at Kermorven's throat. "Run!" yelled Elof. "They fear my sword. It will hold them. Run to the far crossing. Well, you can." Then he whipped back to his own adversaries, and it was as well he did. He had the fraction of a heartbeat to duck aside as a long arm hooked at the air where he had been. In that instant's inattention, Taun's creatures had almost reached him. Gorthar hissed out in their faces, and they dropped back, but only a little way. Elof heard crashing among the trees. At least the others were getting clear. As if in a dream, he noticed for the first time that his panting breath hung in silvered clouds before him, but that, before these Nightwalkers, there was none. Another shape bounded up beside him, and in panic, he almost cut at it before seeing Kermorven. "I told you to run! The others have a start now. Come!" Even as they glanced aside to speak, the wave of dark creatures leaped silently forward. Elof struck down the clutching thing that looked like Borhi, and Kermorven, with a harsh yell of fury, slashed at the thing that was Cassie, sending it crashing backward into the dying fire. "Run now!" he shouted, and seized Elof by the arm. He all but dragged him up the far side of the hollow. Out among the pines they charged, over the barren carpet of dead needles, and out again into the open air. So cold now in the latter hours of the night that it was like breathing the starlight raining down on them. It turned to cold fire in their straining lungs. They overtook Ills, Rock, and Burr as they neared the crossing. They were the shortest of limb. Kermorven had been right to win them a start. "Should we stop again?" wheezed Elof. "Hold the pursuit back once more?" "No," gasped the tall man as they drew level with the others. "In the open, they would only run past us. At the crossing stones, we may hold them." But even as he spoke, they saw dark shapes thrashing through the harsh bushes ahead, hastening to cut them off from the crossing. He set a faster pace to take Elof and himself into the lead. "We may manage to cut our way through. There are not many." He was cut off by a sudden, strangled shriek. A tall, lean figure had come bounding up behind Burr, clawing and clutching at his trailing cloak, and even as they turned, they saw it catch hold and spring upon him as he stumbled, sending them both sprawling among the thorny scrub. Kermorven spat a curse, whirled about, and sprang back with all his lithe speed. He struck out once, tearing the creature loose. It folded its limbs as it fell and sprang at him. His sword scythed in the air and clove the figure in half as it leaped. At once, Kermorven stooped to Burr, but stood abruptly, shaking his head, and came running back to the others, swinging a pack in his hand. "Run!" he shouted, and there was a wilder horror in his voice than they had yet heard. "That was Tenvar took him! Run, ere Burr comes after us in his turn! Run for the last stretch!" The horror of that thought, of being pursued by the friends they had seen slain a moment since, stampeded them all. But as they charged down the last slope, Elof's heart sank in his breast. The instant's delay had cost them the crossing. Dark figures were massed there now, and some were already streaming up the slope towards them. But he saw Kermorven raise his sword with set face and copied him. Here there was no retreating, and if they fought well enough, some at least might win through. He read the same knowledge on Rock's face and on Ilse's, and wondered crazily if in minutes to come he might not be fighting her semblance, or she his. Together, without shout or war cry, they plunged into the last stand of bushes. Then he almost fell over, excuse me, as something huge and black shot up flapping before his face. A harsh scream tore his ears, and from downriver he heard it answered. He looked wildly that way, towards the distant forest where heavy rain clouds swept over the horizon, rising to envelop the sinking moon. Like winged daggers against the clouds, he saw two black silhouettes rise to meet, wheeling, cawing, and squawking in idiotic triumph at what they had found. The bushes blew and riffled into his path, snaring him, holding him. All through him there coursed a sudden thrill, an awareness of some vital change, and a thought that was almost too great for his mind to contain. Then he cupped his free hand skyward and shouted to burst his lungs. "You there, you searching sentinels! Tell your master! Tell him, ravens, with all your speed! I call in my debt! What is owed, I reclaim!" It was as if the world had stopped. A moment of breathless, prickling hush so profound that Elof held his breath, though his lungs labored with the effort. It seemed he must listen hard. The wind was changing. That was what he had felt. From the southwest came a stirring in the air. The light flickered as a vanguard of the cloud bank touched the chill moon and passed across it, blotting it out. A cold droplet, heavy and wet, stung his upturned face. Another. Two more. But for a moment more the moonlight broke through, and in its brief gleam he was appalled to see the dead leap forward. Then the moon might have come crashing down upon the earth. So great was the blast of white violet light that shattered the night. Into the ground before them it struck. Elof reeled from the impact, and the downpour that crashed to the ground like a curtain of steel chain almost knocked the travelers off their feet. Elof recovered, staggering, soaked in an instant, and then as abruptly as the lightning, something huge plunged out of the rain into the midst of them, and he and Kermorvan had to leap for their lives. It was a horse, an immense beast and white, and its shrill neighing rang louder than the wind, the stamp and trampling of its huge hooves louder than the thunder and the roaring rain which danced smoking from its flank. A rider it bore. Elof could see boots in the black stirrups, but all above was hidden by the blinding torrent. Across their path charged the beast. Then it wheeled and reared up against the rain and came thundering back, so close to Elof that he had to jump once more, lost his balance, and crashed down onto the hard, wet earth, almost losing hold of Gorthar. Strong hands seized him and dragged him up. "Run!" screamed Ilse in his ear, and Rock's voice echoed it. "Run! Run!" cried Kermorvan. "They come!" His legs obeyed faster than his mind. He was running before he knew it, running blindly into the sheeting rain, his only guide Ilse's hand on his arm. He glanced back and saw shapes in the grayness bounding hard on their heels. Ilse's grip slipped from him, and he whirled round, ready to fight. But then the great horse was among them again, plunging, snorting, wheeling about as if to trample them all. Its huge flank slammed into him, sending him reeling off backwards in the mud till he plowed into Rock, who had fallen to his knees. Elof hauled him up, and they staggered on after Ilse's voice. The next few minutes were sheerest nightmare, of icy mud and drumming, stinging rain, of falling and being helped up, of helping others up, of losing hold of someone and screaming frantically to stay together, and, most of all, of fighting to stay out from under those maddening, terrifying hooves that came charging out of the storm at every turn or step. Whenever they were least expected, making the travelers jump aside or be knocked off their feet. There might have been 1,000 horses around them, yet Elof knew that there was only one. And always there was the rain, roaring in his ears, hammering on his head till his mind seemed malleable as any metal, his thoughts struck shapeless. Time lost its meaning. How long he had been running, or where to, he had no idea. There was only the mud, the endless ache of exhausted limbs, the hands that dragged him on, the others he dragged in turn, and always, always the white horse plunging, the cascading rain. But suddenly, as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. In the sudden blackness, Elof tripped. He had no choice but to stop running. He risked a hesitant step forward, stumbled, and barked his shin on some sharp, straight edge of stone. Then he cried out in surprise as he himself rammed in the back by a small but solid weight. "Ilse?" he gasped. "Here," came her voice from behind him. "The others?" "Here," said Kermorvan, so close beside them that they both started. "And Rock?" "Here," they heard him say, but he was not so close, and his voice sounded strange, as if there was a faint echo behind it. "What in hell's halls was that all about? And where are we now?" "I guess," said Kermorven carefully, "that on some trifling debt our mastersmith has been given full repayment, and an excellent rate of use, and that more than one power found us when we quit the forest. But to answer your second question, I fear we must stand quiet and await the dawn. Do not move till you can see. Who knows now where we might be?" Silence fell, broken only by heavy breathing. But despite their fierce run, nobody was panting, and Elof felt no more tired than he had been before. His limbs had been aching just as badly then. Very slowly he stooped to touch the stone at his feet, and the contact sent a shiver of excitement through him. Cold and bleak it felt, covered with lichen, but its shape, its sharp edges, were regular, formed, made. Then he looked up and saw that the blackness had turned to gray, but it was the gray of evening, not dawn. Beside him stood Kermorven and Ills, staring wildly at the immense heap of rocks that loomed up before them, high enough to blot out all else, spreading out like arms on either side to form a small bay or cleft. In a narrow gap at the base of the wall stood Rock, and he was gaping idiotically, not at them, but past them. They looked at each other, and as they turned, Ills gave a little shriek, and Kermorven swallowed visibly. The end of the bay was open. Before them, clear cut in the cold air, a vast plain stretched out unbroken to the far horizon, flat and barren save for the frost-twisted remnants of grass and bush. The cold was devastating, the light clear but thin, as if here the sun were forever veiled. In all that chilly emptiness, no bird sang, no beast moved, no figure stirred, and of island, of river, there was never a trace. They were utterly alone.